Why does this sound sad? Nobody told you that it's sad. The piece has no words to tell you how to feel. Yet, if we asked 1,000 people what the Schindler's List theme feels like, they would probably say sad. So how is it that patterns of sounds with no words can make two people feel exactly the same thing? Well, let's get into it. Now, before I go back and explain to you exactly how Schindler's List feels sad, firstly, I want to give you a more direct example. And that example is the piece Elegy by Fauré. An elegy in music is quite interesting because it's supposed to be a lament for the dead. The entire purpose of an elegy is to grieve. And lots of composers have written elegies, but in Fauré's elegy in particular, he wrote it in 1880, and he originally wrote it as the slow movement in a sonata that he later abandoned and just released the piece by itself as an elegy. Which means that this particular piece isn't about grieving any particular person like many elegies do, but anyone listening to this piece will feel the grief in the music. So the opening of this particular piece does several things that make it sound sad and grieving. First of all, it's in C minor, and if you want a piece to sound downtrodden, like it's depressed, then minor is usually the best way of doing that. And it opens with just the piano part playing this. So this uses a particular feature that is used in a lot of funeral marches and things like that, and it's the persistent chords that have a very regular pattern. The way that music creates certain feelings that are universal, that a lot of different people have never met each other will feel, is by replicating the body and the voice. The way that we communicate with each other and the way that we behave when we feel grief or any other emotion is what music directly replicates in order to make you experience that feeling when listening to it. So if we take the opening of this piece where you have these very persistent C minor chords like this, that is essentially tapping into exactly the same idea that Chopin's Funeral March taps into, and that sounds like this. And that kind of directly replicates the feeling of that slow march in a funeral procession, which Fauré's elegy also kind of has that same feeling. It's persistent, it feels like slow, plodding steps. But music, being a tonal thing, also represents the voice, and when we communicate, we use pitch in order to communicate. For example, if I was to ask a question, then I would raise the intonation at the end of my sentence. And in fact, music does that exact thing. When it wants to ask a question, it rises in pitch too. But this means in a situation like this, what makes this music sound like grief is the crying out sound of the cello's single line melody over the top of these persistent plodding chords. And as I mentioned in my video about Elgar's cello concerto, the cello is the closest sound that there is to the voice. It really does sound like crying out at the beginning of the piece. There's something about the cello that just sounds like someone is using words when they're not. It sounds like they're telling us a direct story. Something else that is often used with sad, grieving music is the idea of descending like you are sinking into the ground. And once again, this is a very physical representation that music is trying to convey. If I play something like this, because I'm sinking down the piano, it feels like we're kind of sinking with it, physically. And you also get that an awful lot in this piece of music, like in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th bar, where the bass notes are sinking. Now, most listeners to pieces of music are not thinking about this. They're not thinking about what music is physically representing, or they're not thinking about how the melody is representing the voice. But they do directly feel it, which is why when you listen to a piece of music, you feel the way that you do, because you recognize in the music things that you can relate to. Now, what is interesting to me and what makes music so interesting is that this piece is not going to stay the same. It's not going to continue with those repeated notes and with that same singing melody throughout, because like in life, stories develop. And the other types of emotions that you might feel as part of that story is things like anger or being upset that what was is no longer, or nostalgia and being reflective. These are all parts of what it means to feel grief. And in moments like that, you can hear the kind of passionate, outcrying sort of anger that is felt in the music. And if in the melody, you actually think about when you are communicating with someone else, what conveys anger? It's the volume, it's the pitch at which you talk, it's the persistence and things like that. And that is exactly what's happening here. You get the same notes persisting, it's much louder, it's higher pitched than we've had before. But then, of course, we also get nostalgia. So for this section, there are a couple of things that have changed that change the feeling of the music altogether. First of all, you have this kind of shimmering padded underlay in the piano, which creates a sense of warmth in the music. But also in this particular section of the music, we're no longer in C minor, we're actually in A flat major. And you can hear that shift in quality. Instead of this dark, repetitive sound that we got at the beginning, now we're getting this kind of warm sound, which has a much brighter feel to it. Now, the reason that that is the case between major and minor, if we take a major chord and we compare that to a minor chord has a lower middle note compared to a major chord. So a major chord sounds more like it's leaning upwards and a minor chord feels like it's leaning downwards. And therefore, generally, when we hear major, we hear of it as a more open sound, and when we hear minor, we hear it as a more darker kind of inward sound. Also, now that crying out vibrato cello that we had is now part of the accompaniment, and the piano has the melody, which sounds much brighter in general in terms of quality of sound. But then, if you are remembering the good times, at some point that's got to come to an end, and you've got to be faced with reality, right? When I was in the depths of learning the piano, there are lots of tools that I wish I'd had. And that is exactly why I built an app called The Practice Room. The Practice Room is an all-in-one place where you can log your practice sessions, get statistics and insights about your playing. There are resources like theory articles, an entire pieces library with backgrounds for all the pieces, what you should be able to do before you play them, what you'll get from learning them. There are practice tools that will help you fix your playing, that will help you recognize chords and pieces of music, even a metronome. And I also do deep dive live practice clinics every 2 weeks on a very specific topic about learning the piano. So if that sounds of interest to you, then check it out with the link in the description. Okay, back to the video. It's really fascinating because you can hear the turn out of the feeling of nostalgia to a more aggressive sound again, and then you've got this incredibly passionate crying out when the melody returns. So this piece is doing what most other pieces do, which is at about 2/3 of the way through, you get the peak of the piece. And in any story, you have a starting point, which in this case is grief. And then 2/3 of the way through, you go through something that changes your perspective on where you started. The music is much louder, it's more erratic, there's more quick notes, in the same way that if you were feeling anger, you would speak quickly, you'd probably be slightly more erratic, you'd be louder. And then once again, we have the return of that familiar grieving melody, but this time much louder, with the piano playing lots of quick notes underneath. Now, Fauré's elegy is interesting because it's an elegy, it's about the grieving process, and those are the features in the music that make us feel that. And a lot of these features will become important again when we talk about Schindler's List. However, I also want to show you how different feelings can be created by different things in different pieces. So firstly, Hedwig's theme from Harry Potter. How does that piece create a sense of wonder and magic when it's only a few notes? So with Hedwig's theme, the first thing to mention is the fact that it's played on a celeste. And that means it has a very trebly kind of timbre, and timbre just means quality of sound. And that high-pitched bell sound is used a lot in order to create the sense of wonder in music. Also, something that's more hidden in the music, which you might only realize if you looked at the piece of music, is that the music is in groups of 3. You hear this kind of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 kind of feeling. And when a piece of music is in 3, it feels more dancey. And then on top of that, there is something called a pedal note. And a pedal note in music is where a note repeats under moving chords. And in this case, we have this repetitive E that's going on under everything over the top of it. And this time, unlike in Fauré's elegy, which kind of has a similar concept where the chords are repeating at the beginning, in this case, it's much slower, and the chords over the top are moving, so it creates a bed for those notes to sit on top of. And that bed that we are sitting on top of also makes it incredibly obvious when notes start to sound weird. For example, when we get... this sounds kind of weird, and that's because those notes don't belong to E minor, which is the key that we're playing in. So it almost sounds like reality has been distorted in some way. You get a similar thing when you get... Now, in the next part, in the actual version of Hedwig's theme, you get this massive sweeping string sound. You get this sound of weaving throughout the music, which directly represents something physical in the film. So that's how the features of Hedwig's theme make it sound so wondrous. The use of the instruments and the timbre so that it sounds up in the clouds, the fast-moving strings to represent physical movement, the slightly unusual moving harmony to represent something unusual. They all work together to create the sense of wonder. Now, another piece that is very different is the piece Clair de Lune, which has a much calmer sound. It sounds very tranquil. And Clair de Lune itself means moonlight. Now, very much in the same way as Hedwig's theme, this starts very high-pitched, but it's very different in the sound it makes. First of all, Hedwig's theme is in a minor key, very much like Fauré's elegy was in a minor key. Debussy's Clair de Lune is in a major key though, so it has a brighter quality of sound to it. However, the flexibility of time within this piece makes it feel like time is standing still, like you've got all the space in the world. So in this, where you play... There's so much space between the notes that it feels very calm and still. Also, unlike the strings in Hedwig's theme, which were running up and then back down again, here we are sinking very slowly downwards. You start up here, and then it sinks down. Almost like a feather slowly moving downwards through the air. When I'm learning a piece of music, I always think it's very important for me to try and come up with some imagery that represent what's happening in the piece of music. Because music does directly reflect physical movement and the voice and how we communicate so much. We recognize a slow descent as much more calming than a quick descent because of what we experience in the real world. Now, in this particular piece, it also uses chromatic movement. As I said earlier, when we communicate and we ask a question, we lift pitch. Well, the same thing does happen in music. So right at the beginning, where we have this, the left hand lifts up, and it almost asks a question before responding. And we experience the music that way directly because of how we communicate, which is why music is often considered a universal language, because it's something that we all understand intuitively just because we all communicate like that. Now, one other example I want to give you before looking at Schindler's List is Somewhere Over the Rainbow and how that creates hope in the music. So this song is really fascinating to me because there's quite a lot of things going on. In a lot of versions of this piece, the introduction ends with that same feather-like feeling that we got from Debussy, which is this. It's using that same kind of gravity, physical gesture of falling down. Then, when the melody comes in, what this piece is most famous for is the first two notes in the melody, which are... And that is an octave jump. It's from a C to a C in this case, which once again has that physical idea of kind of jumping up into the clouds where you have a hope, right? We're kind of reaching out for something that we don't have. And there is also a moment in the chords that directly change how we feel about what's being said in the music. And that is where we get an F major chord, and then an F minor chord. And like I said before, major is a much wider feeling and minor is a much more closed feeling. So when we move from major to minor, we feel a sense of closing in. And in this case, it turns the music from hope to kind of sadness that she's not there. Now, when most people listen to this piece of music, they don't acknowledge that at all, but you definitely feel it. So now let's look at Schindler's List and see if you can work out why it feels the way it does. So, Schindler's List as a piece is incredibly interesting because it encapsulates everything that I've just talked about in all of the other pieces. It's in a minor key and feels very introverted. It has the same singing strings that we had in Fauré's Elegy. In Fauré's Elegy, we had a cello singing out and representing that vocal line. In this case, we have a violin doing exactly the same thing. And those elements together create an intense amount of grief in the music. We also have that funeral-like repetitive underlying harmony, but it's written in a very similar way to the E is written in Hedwig's theme, which helps create that sense of wonder. The piece opens in the melody with an octave jump in exactly the same way we had in Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which also gives a kind of sense of hope to the music. So the question that I asked you at the very beginning of this video was, why does this feel sad? And the answer is, a lot of music does reflect physical movement and the way that we communicate with each other. It reflects imagery and also body language, and also melodies massively reflects the way that we communicate with each other. When you have a piece of music that does deeply reflect grief, but at the same time have these hopeful parts to it, it becomes a piece that is even more tragic. Because one of the most tragic things in life is what could have been, right? As a pianist or other instrumentalist, this becomes the difference between playing notes and playing meaning. Executing the playing of a piece, or finding meaning and what the piece represents, and communicating with people. There is in fact one thing that all of these pieces have done, and all music does, that no one ever actually tells you. And if you want to find out what that is, then head on through, and I will see you there.